The cry went up just as the sky bled from bruised purple into the black of true night. It was a single voice, a nanny's shriek from the royal wing, sharp enough to slice through the evening calm of the citadel. A moment of stunned silence, and then the chaos erupted. Torches flared to life in the courtyard. Guards, their faces grim under the flickering light, began shouting orders. The scent of fear, sharp and acrid, cut through the cold pine air. King Edric stood on the great balcony, a silhouette of immense power against the rising moon. He did not move, he did not speak, but the stillness that came off him was more terrifying than any roar. It was a cold, gathering pressure that made the very stones of the castle seem to hold their breath. The pack felt it. The kingdom felt it. A captain, his face pale, sprinted across the marble floor and fell to one knee. "Your Majesty, they are gone, all three of them." Still, Edric did not turn. His voice, when it came, was low, a rumble like stones grinding deep within the earth. "Gone. We've searched the nursery, the gardens, the kitchens. They are not in the keep. The nannies. They say they were there an hour ago. And now," the captain's voice faltered, "the Omega is also missing, the one who was exiled this morning." The name hung in the air, unspoken but screamed by every mind. Calla. The assumption was instant, a poison spreading through the court, kidnapping, treason. An Omega cur, a worthless stray, had stolen the future of the pack, the Alpha King's heirs. Finally, Edric turned. His eyes were not the cool gray of a winter sky they were known to be. They were silver fire, molten and merciless. The temperature on the balcony dropped 10 degrees. "Find her," he commanded. The words were not shouted. They were worse. They were a promise of utter annihilation. "Bring me my children, and bring me the Omega who took them." 12 hours earlier, the wind had been her only companion. It was a vicious thing, born in the northern peaks and sharpened on glaciers. It clawed at the thin wool of her cloak, stealing what little warmth she possessed. Calla kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the muddy, half-frozen track that led away from the only home she had ever known. Exiled. The word was a brand on her soul. Her father's face floated in her memory, his lips curled in a triumphant sneer. He had stood before the council, his voice ringing with false piety, accusing her of petty thefts, of consorting with spirits, of being a blight on the pack's purity. Lies. All of it. But he was a ranking member, and she was an Omega, an orphan he'd deigned to raise after her mother's passing. Her word was worth less than the dirt under his boots. They had believed him. Or, it had been easier to believe him. Easier to cast out one useless girl than to challenge a man of his standing. So they had given her a small satchel with a stale loaf of bread, a water skin, and the cloak on her back. They had pointed her toward the northern gate, the one that opened into the unforgiving wilderness, and told her not to return. The sentence was death. Just a slower, colder version of the executioner's axe. Her hands were numb, shoved deep into her pockets. She could feel the ghost of the scullery, the heat of the dishwater, the rough texture of the floor tiles she scrubbed daily. Worthless. Her father's favorite word for her. She had spent her life trying to disprove it, trying to be small enough, quiet enough, useful enough to be allowed to exist. It had never been enough. A strange, brittle feeling cracked through the ice of her despair. It felt almost like freedom. No more flinching from her father's heavy hand. No more enduring the whispers and scornful looks of the pack. No more breaking her back from dawn until midnight just to earn a cold bed and a half-filled bowl. The wilderness was cruel, but it was honest in its cruelty. It would kill her, probably, but it would not lie to her first. She stopped, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and looked back. The great stone walls of the capital were just a gray line against the horizon. Good riddance. She turned her face to the north, toward the endless sea of pine and snow, and took another step. And then another. A sound made her freeze, a soft crunching in the snow-dusted undergrowth behind her. A wolf, she thought, a predator, drawn by the scent of the weak and alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She fumbled in her satchel, her fingers closing around the only thing she had that might be a weapon. A small, sharp stone she'd picked up without thinking. She turned slowly, her knuckles white. It was not a wolf. 3 small figures stood on the path, their silver blonde hair catching the pale morning light. They were bundled in the finest furs, their cheeks rosy from the cold. The oldest, a boy of about 7, stood with his chin up, trying to look brave. His younger sister, perhaps 5, clung to his hand, her wide eyes fixed on Calla. The youngest, another boy, no older than 3, sat stubbornly in the snow, his thumb in his mouth. The royal cubs. Calla's blood ran cold, colder than the wind, colder than the ground beneath her feet. No, 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 no. What are you doing here? Her voice was a ragged whisper. The oldest boy, Leo, took a step forward. We followed you. You can't be here, she said, her voice shaking. You have to go back, right now. The little girl, Lyra, shook her head, her grip tightening on her brother's hand. Don't want to go back. Want to go with you. Calla's mind screamed. This was a death sentence. Her death sentence. If she was found with them, no one would believe they had followed her. They would think she had taken them. The exiled Omega, stealing the king's children for revenge. They would hunt her down and tear her apart. You don't understand, she pleaded, taking a step toward them. The youngest, Finn, took his thumb out of his mouth and held his arms up to her. Calla up, he demanded. Her heart fractured. She was the one who snuck them sweet cakes from the kitchen, the one who told them stories of forest spirits when their nannies were busy, the one who hummed the old lullabies her mother had taught her until they fell asleep. To them, she wasn't a worthless Omega. She was just Calla. Listen to me, she said, crouching down, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Your father will be worried. The whole castle will be looking for you. You must go home. No, Leo said, his little face set in a stubborn frown that was a perfect miniature copy of the king's. Nanny Elspeth said you were a blight. She said they were casting you out. We don't want you to be cast out. Tears pricked at Calla's eyes, hot and sharp. That's very kind of you. But you are the future of this pack. You are alphas. I am nothing. You cannot be with me. You're not nothing, Lyra whispered, finally letting go of her brother to take a hesitant step closer. She reached out a small, mittened hand and touched Calla's arm. You're warm. The simple observation shattered her. She, who was always cold, always on the outside. Warm. She had to get them back. But the capital was already miles behind them. They were small, and the wilderness was vast. They would freeze or be taken by predators before they got halfway. Leaving them was as impossible as taking them. She was trapped. Utterly and completely trapped by the affection of 3 children who should have been her enemies. All right, she said, her voice hollow. She scooped Finn into her arms. His small body was a surprising weight, and he immediately snuggled against her neck, his cold nose pressing into her skin. All right. We'll find a place to get warm, and then we figure out how to get you home. She looked back the way she came, then forward into the deepening woods. Both paths led to her death. One was just a little warmer for a little while longer. She chose the woods. The first few hours were a blur of panicked survival. Calla's meager supplies were a joke against the needs of 3 royal children. Their fine furs were not meant for a true trek in the wilderness, and Finn was already shivering. I'm hungry, Lyra announced, her voice small. Calla broke her single loaf of bread into 4 pieces, giving the 3 largest to the children. She watched them devour the stale bread as if it were a feast. She ate her own small piece slowly, forcing herself to chew, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Every crunch of a twig, every rustle of the wind sounded like approaching guards. She found a small overhang of rock, barely a cave, but it offered some protection from the relentless wind. She gathered dry pine needles and branches, her hands clumsy and stiff with cold, and used the flint and steel she'd secretly packed, a habit from years of lighting kitchen fires before dawn, to coax a tiny, sputtering flame to life. The children huddled close to it, their faces illuminated by the small blaze. The fear in their eyes had begun to fade, replaced by a sort of weary wonder. "You made fire," Leo said, his voice full of awe. "My mother taught me," Calla murmured, feeding another twig to the flame. "She said fire was a friend to the lost." She felt a pang of grief, sharp and sudden. Her mother had been a healer, an outsider who had married into the pack and never truly been accepted. She had died when Calla was barely older than Leo, leaving her to her father's cold mercies. "Will you tell us a story?" Lyra asked, her eyelids drooping. Calla hesitated. Stories were a luxury they couldn't afford, but looking at their tired, trusting faces, she couldn't refuse. "All right, just a short one." She told them a story her mother used to tell, about the spirits of the ancient forest, the ones who slept in the heartwood of the pines and danced in the winter frost. She lowered her voice, mimicking the whisper of the wind and the crackle of the fire. Finn fell asleep in her lap, his breathing soft and even. Soon, Lyra was leaning against her side, also asleep. Leo fought it for a while longer, the responsible older brother, before his head nodded and he slumped against her other side. She sat there for a long time, trapped beneath the warm weight of the king's children, the fire casting flickering shadows on the rock. This was madness. She was an exile, an omega. She was harboring the most important members of the pack that had cast her out. The king, their father. He was known as the Wolf King, the Cold King, a ruler of iron and ice. What he would do to her, it didn't bear thinking about. Her duty was clear. She had to take them back. But the thought of walking back through that gate, of handing them over only to be seized and dragged to a dungeon, and worse, the thought of returning them to a world where their nannies called people blights. A knot of defiance tightened in her chest. They were safe with her. They were warm. For now. That had to be enough. When the fire burned low, she arranged the sleeping children as comfortably as she could, covering them with her own cloak. The cold bit into her instantly, a familiar ache in her bones. Sleep was a risk, but she was exhausted. She curled up at the mouth of the small shelter, a barrier between the children and the night, and closed her eyes, listening to the vast, lonely dark. The sound of a heavy footfall snapped her awake. Not a twig snap, but the deliberate crunch of a boot on frozen ground. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was too soon. They couldn't have found them this fast. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the sharp stone again. A tall figure blocked the entrance to their makeshift shelter, his form a massive shadow against the pre-dawn gloom. He was alone, but his size, the sheer presence of him, was more intimidating than a whole squad of guards. "Do not move," a voice said. It was the voice from the balcony, the one that sounded like grinding stone, but quieter now, and laced with a deadly tension. Calla stood frozen, her arm protectively in front of the sleeping children. The man took a step into the faint glow of the dying embers, and her breath caught. It was him, the Alpha King, Edric. She had only ever seen him from a distance, a remote figure in silver and black. Up close he was overwhelming. Taller than she'd imagined, broader. His face was all harsh lines and sharp angles, carved from granite and fury. And his eyes. His eyes were fixed on her, glowing with that same terrifying silver light she'd seen from the balcony. He wasn't looking at his children. He was looking at her. And he looked haggard. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his jaw was clenched so tight she was surprised it didn't crack. He was tracking them himself, alone. "Where did you think you could take them?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "I didn't take them," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "They followed me." A humorless smile touched his lips. It held no warmth. Of course they did. 3 alpha cubs, heirs to the throne, decided to follow a disgraced Omega into a frozen wasteland. A likely story. It's the truth. "My children are not fools," he snarled, taking another step. "They were lured, coaxed. By you. For what? Ransom? Revenge on the pack that rightly threw you out? No, I would never—" He moved then, faster than she could track, his hand shooting out and grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron. Cold. So cold it burned. He yanked her away from the children, spinning her around and slamming her back against the cold rock wall. The stone scraped her back through her thin tunic. The sharp rock she was holding clattered to the ground. "Do not lie to me," he breathed, his face inches from hers. His scent filled her senses. Pine, cold steel, and a deep, ancient wildness that spoke of the wolf within. It was terrifying and, to her shame, utterly captivating. "I have spent the last 12 hours tracking you. My enemies circle my throne like vultures. My heirs are my only weakness, and you stole them. Give me one reason why I shouldn't end you right here and now." Tears of fear and frustration welled in her eyes. "Because they are safe," she choked out. "Because they were cold and I made them warm. They were hungry and I fed them. Look at them. Just look." For the first time, his gaze flickered past her to the sleeping pile of furs. He saw his 3 children, huddled together, sleeping peacefully. He saw her cloak, the only one she had covering them. His grip on her arm loosened by a fraction. The silver fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of confusion. A small, sleepy voice piped up from the pile. "Papa?" Lyra was sitting up, rubbing her eyes. She saw her father, saw him holding Calla against the wall, and her face crumpled. "You're hurting her," she cried out. "Let go of Calla." Edric froze. He looked from his distraught daughter to the woman pinned beneath his hand. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, but her eyes, wide and terrified, held no deceit. Only a fierce, desperate honesty. He released her so abruptly she stumbled. Leo and Finn were awake now too. Leo scrambled to his feet and put himself between his father and Calla, a tiny, furious protector. "She didn't steal us. We went with her. You were mean to her." Edric stared at his children, then back at Calla. The certainty in his posture began to crumble, replaced by a weary uncertainty. He had been so sure. A simple, clean narrative, a vengeful Omega, a kidnapping, a swift and brutal justice. But the scene in front of him was wrong. His children weren't scared of her. They were defending her. Against him. "We are going back," he said, his voice flat, all the fire gone from it, leaving only cold ash. He looked at Calla, his eyes hooded and unreadable. "You will come with us. You will explain this to my council. And if you are lying—" He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. He was a king, politically trapped, his enemies waiting for any sign of weakness. A missing heir was a weakness. 3 was a catastrophe. He couldn't afford for the truth to be complicated. But it was. It was standing right in front of him, shivering in a thin tunic, with his daughter's hand now tucked firmly in hers. The journey back was a silent, tense affair. Edric walked ahead, a thundercloud in human form, breaking the trail. Calla followed, with Lyra holding her hand and Leo walking beside her, casting suspicious glances at his father's back. She carried Finn, who refused to be held by anyone else. The boundary between them was a chasm of mistrust and rank. He was the king who held her life in his hands. She was the prisoner he was escorting to her own trial. And yet, the presence of the children complicated everything. "Are you still cold?" she murmured to Lyra, tucking the girl's fur collar up higher. "A little," Lyra admitted. Up ahead, Edric stopped. Without turning, he shrugged off his own heavy, fur-lined cloak. It was a magnificent thing, black as a wolf's pelt, with a silver clasp in the shape of a snarling wolf's head. He held it out behind him. "Take it," he commanded. Calla stared at his back. "Your Majesty, I can't." "That was not a request," he said, his voice tight. "My daughter is cold. Your cloak is on my son. You are shivering. Take the cloak." Hesitantly, she took it. The fur was impossibly soft, and it was warm from his body. As she wrapped it around herself and Lyra, she was enveloped in his scent. Pine and steel and that wild, clean scent of winter. It felt like being wrapped in power itself. She pulled the hood up, hiding her face, her heart hammering. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it was also the first kindness she had been shown by anyone in the pack in years, and it came from the one man she should fear the most. The wall of his anger had its first crack. They walked on. The silence stretched, broken only by the crunch of their boots. "Why were you exiled?" Edric asked suddenly, his voice low, not turning around. Calla's breath hitched. My father accused me of things. Before the council." "What things?" "Theft. Dark magic." She swallowed. "Being a drain on the pack's resources. The last one was the truest, the one that had cut the deepest." "And were you?" he asked. "A thief?" "No, Your Majesty." "A witch?" "No, Your Majesty." He was silent for a long moment. "My council is not known for its compassion," he said, almost to himself. "But they are not fools. They do not exile for sport. Your father must have been very convincing." "He is a respected man," Calla said, the words tasting like poison. "What is his name?" "Garrick, sire." Edric stopped dead. He turned, and this time, there was no anger in his eyes, only a sharp, assessing intelligence. "Garrick is your father? Head of the merchant clan?" "Yes, sire." A muscle worked in his jaw. "I see." He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing a different person than the one he'd found by the fire. "Garrick has been petitioning me for months to form a new trade alliance with the Blackwood Pack, an alliance I have repeatedly refused." Calla's blood went cold. The Blackwood Pack were their rivals, ruthless and ambitious. An alliance with them would shift the balance of power in the territories. He argued that a betrothal would seal it, Edric continued, his voice dangerously soft. He offered his daughter. Calla stared at him, uncomprehending. What? "He has a daughter. A true-born daughter from his second wife. Not." He trailed off, his gaze sweeping over her. "Not an omega from a healer he took in." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her father didn't just want her gone. He wanted her erased. He couldn't have an omega daughter, a blight, associated with his name while he was trying to marry his other, more valuable daughter, into a rival pack for political gain. Exiling Calla cleaned the slate. The thought was so monstrous, so cold, that she felt dizzy. Before she could process it, a sound split the air, the sharp whistle of an arrow. Edric moved with a speed that was not human. He grabbed Calla, shoving her and the children behind him as the arrow thudded into the tree where his head had been a second before. "Ha! Ambush!" he roared, his own blade appearing in his hand as if by magic. Figures emerged from the trees, clad in dark leathers, their faces obscured. They were not pack guards, They were mercenaries, and leading them, his face twisted in a mask of rage and greed, was her father. The king, alone and with his pups. Garrick snarled. What a gift. The Blackwood Alpha will pay handsomely for them, and for the little stray who was supposed to disappear. Father, no! Calla cried out, horrified. You were always a mistake. Garrick spat at her, his eyes full of hate. Should have drowned you at birth. Then he pointed at Edric. Take them. The mercenaries surged forward. Edric met them, a whirlwind of steel and fury. He was the Alpha King, and even alone, he was a force of nature. But there were too many. One of the men broke past him, lunging for the children. Calla reacted without thinking. She shoved Leo and Lyra behind her, holding Finn tight, and stood her ground. The man grinned, a brutal, ugly expression, and raised his club. This is it, she thought. But the blow never landed. A dark shape slammed into the man, and he went down with a strangled cry. It was Edric. He had fought his way back to them, but now his back was exposed. Garrick saw his chance. He charged, a long knife in his hand, aimed for the king's unprotected side. Look out! Calla screamed. Edric spun, but it was too late. He couldn't block it in time. Calla did the only thing she could. She moved. She pushed Finn into Leo's arms and threw herself in front of the king. She expected the searing pain of the blade. Instead, there was a heavy impact, and a grunt of pain from behind her. Edric had caught her, pulling her back against his chest with one arm while his other hand had shot out and caught Garrick's wrist. He held it in a grip of iron, the knife hovering inches from Calla's side. For a moment, all was still. Father and king, locked in a deadly tableau over the Omega who stood between them. You would use my own daughter against me? Edric's voice was pure ice. She is nothing, Garrick raged, struggling in his grip. She is a worthless... With a sharp twist, Edric broke Garrick's wrist. The knife fell. Garrick screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. The other mercenaries, seeing their leader fall and their payday disappear, hesitated. Go, Edric commanded them, his voice a low thunder that promised death. Tell your Blackwood masters what happens when they send dogs to do a wolf's work. Tell them the Northern King sends his regards. They fled, melting back into the woods, dragging a whimpering Garrick with them. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. Calla was still pressed against Edric's chest, his arm a band of steel around her. She could feel the frantic beat of his heart. Or maybe it was her own. She couldn't tell. He had saved her, after she had tried to save him. Slowly, he released her. He looked down at her, his silver eyes searching her face. The anger, the suspicion, it was all gone. In its place was something she couldn't name. Something deep and complicated and overwhelming. You were telling the truth, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she whispered, her whole body trembling. He had defeated her father, the man who had tormented her for her entire life. The villain was gone. But as she looked at the king's grim face, she knew the real danger had just begun. Her father had been a symptom. The disease was the political rot he was a part of, and now they were walking right back into it. Their arrival at the castle was met with a wave of stunned silence, followed by joyous cries. The king had returned, and he had the heirs. The panic of the night dissolved into relief. But the relief curdled as they saw who was with him. Calla, the exiled Omega, walking beside the king, wrapped in his own cloak, with the youngest prince in her arms. The whispers started immediately. What was she doing here? Why wasn't she in chains? Edric ignored them all. He swept through the courtyard and into the great hall, Calla trailing in his wake like a shadow. His council was assembled, their faces a mixture of relief and stern disapproval. Lord Valerius, the council head and Edric's most vocal opponent, stepped forward. Your Majesty, he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. We are overjoyed at the safe return of the princes and princess, a crisis averted by your swift action. His eyes flicked to Kala, dripping with contempt. Now, the matter of this. Creature's punishment can be addressed. For the kidnapping of royal heirs, the only sentence is death. She did not kidnap them, Edric stated, his voice ringing with authority. They followed her. She protected them. Valerius raised a skeptical eyebrow. A convenient tale, told by an exiled Omega with every reason to lie. She led them into the wilderness, endangering the entire royal line. Your judgment is clouded, sire. Your affection for your children makes you vulnerable. It was a blatant challenge to his authority, made in front of the entire court. Edric's enemies were no longer circling, they were closing in. They were using his children, and now Kala, as weapons against him. My judgment is perfectly clear, Valerius, Edric said, his voice dangerously low. Kala is under my protection. She will be housed in the royal wing as a guest of the crown. A collective gasp went through the hall. An Omega, a guest in the royal wing? It was unheard of. Sire, this is madness, Valerius protested. The pack will not stand for it. To elevate this, nobody. I was not asking for the pack's opinion, Edric cut him off, his silver eyes flashing. I was giving an order. Anyone who objects can take their concerns to my dungeons. He turned his back on the sputtering lord, a clear dismissal, and looked at Kala. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Come. He led her away from the stunned court, up the winding stairs to the family quarters. The children were swept away by relieved nannies, but not before Finn threw his arms around Kala's neck in a fierce hug. Stay, Kala, he whispered. I'll be right here, she promised, her heart aching. The rooms Edric gave her were opulent, larger than the entire hovel she'd shared with her father. There was a fire already roaring in the hearth, a soft bed piled with furs, and a view of the snow-covered mountains. It was more than she could have ever dreamed of. And it felt like the most beautiful prison in the world. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Edric had protected her, but in doing so, he had painted an even larger target on her back. He had defied his counsel for her. He had made her a symbol. And symbols were often the first casualties in a war. Later that night, a soft knock came at her door. It was Edric. He entered, closing the door quietly behind him. He looked tired, the burdens of his kingdom heavy on his shoulders. Are you comfortable? He asked. This is more than I deserve, Your Majesty, she said, dipping into a curtsy. My name is Edric, he said, his voice quiet. And you deserve more than this. You saved my children, and you would have given your life for me. I do not forget such debts. It was nothing. It was everything, he corrected her gently. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark wilderness. Valerius and his faction will not let this go. They see you as a weakness they can exploit. They will try to remove you, by any means necessary. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her. Then I should leave. I can slip away. It would be better for you. No, he said, turning to face her. His eyes were intense. Their quarrel is not with you. It is with me. You are simply the weapon they have chosen. And besides, he added, a wry, tired smile touching his lips, my children would never forgive me if I let you go. The boundary between them was eroding with every word, every shared glance. He was no longer just the king, and she was no longer just the Omega. They were two people bound by a shared crisis, by the love of 3 small children, and by an ambush in the snow. Why are they doing this? She asked, needing to understand. Why do they oppose you? Because I am not my father, he said, his voice laced with old bitterness. My father was a conqueror. He believed in strength through domination. He forged alliances with packs like Blackwood. I believe in strength through prosperity. I want to build, not conquer. Men like Valerius, who grew fat on my father's wars, see peace as weakness. They have been waiting for a chance to prove me unfit to rule." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And my lack of a mate, an alpha queen, has not helped. It makes my line appear vulnerable, unsettled." He was so lonely. The realization hit Calla with the force of a physical blow. The most powerful man in the kingdom was utterly alone, trapped by his own crown. "You should rest," he said, his voice softening again. "You are safe here. I swear it." He turned to leave, but Calla's voice stopped him. "Edric." He paused at the door. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me." He gave a single, sharp nod and was gone, leaving her alone with the fire and the ghost of his scent in the air. She was no longer worthless. She was a threat. And in this kingdom, that was a far more dangerous thing to be. The next few days were a strange dream. Calla stayed within the royal wing, a gilded cage. The children were her constant companions, dragging her into their games, demanding stories, treating her with an uncomplicated affection that was both a balm and a terror. Through them, she saw a side of Edric no one else did. The tired father who would let his daughter braid his hair, the patient king who would get on the floor to play wolves with his sons. He sought her out in the evenings. Their conversations became the anchor of her days. They spoke of the pack, of his dreams for the kingdom, of her mother's healing arts. He asked her about the old songs, the forest lore she knew. He listened with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. The chasm between them was shrinking, becoming a space filled with a fragile, growing trust. But outside their small bubble, the storm was gathering. The whispers in the court grew louder. Valerius and his allies painted her as a conniving witch who had ensnared the king's mind. They spread rumors that she was a spy for Blackwood, that her father's attack was a sham to install her in the castle. The crisis came to a head during the winter feast. Edric, in a bold move of defiance, had insisted Calla attend, seated at his table. She wore a simple gown of deep blue that a kind-faced servant had found for her, and she felt like a crow in a flock of peacocks. The glares from the high-born lords and ladies were like physical blows. Valerius rose to give a toast. "To the kingdom," he said, his eyes glittering with malice as they landed on Calla. "And to the purity of its ancient bloodlines. May we always be vigilant against those who would seek to dilute or poison them." The insult was obvious. The hall fell silent. Edric's hand clenched into a fist on the table. Before he could speak, a scream came from the royal nursery. It was a nanny's voice, raw with terror. Edric was on his feet in an instant, Calla right behind him. They raced up the stairs, dread a cold stone in their stomachs. The guards at the nursery door were slumped against the wall, unconscious. Inside, the scene was one of dark magic. The air was unnaturally cold and black. Creeping frost was spreading across the floor from the center of the room. The three children lay in their beds, pale and still, their chests barely moving. The frost was crawling up their blankets, reaching for them. It was a curse, slow and suffocating. "No," Edric breathed, his voice breaking. He rushed to Leo's side, his hands hovering over his son's chilling form. "Leo! Lyra! Finn!" They didn't stir. A healer rushed in, but stopped at the door, his face ashen. "Dark magic, sire. A withering curse. I cannot fight this." Panic seized Edric. The king, the warrior, the absolute ruler was helpless. His enemies had bypassed him and gone straight for his heart. He fell to his knees beside the bed, his face a mask of pure agony. This was it. The checkmate. They had taken his future, and he could do nothing. Calla watched, her own heart shattering at his despair. She saw the frost, black and unnatural, touch Finn's small hand, and something inside her broke. Not rage, not fear, but a vast, resounding refusal. No, the word was not spoken. It was a feeling, a force that welled up from the deepest part of her soul. You will not have them. She walked to the center of the room, to the source of the chilling cold. There, inlaid in the floorboards, was a small, almost invisible metal disc, pulsing with a faint, dark light. The curse's anchor. She had never noticed it before, but now she saw it as clearly as if it were a bonfire. She knelt, her hand outstretched. She didn't know what she was doing, only that she had to. This cold was wrong. It was a violation of life, and every fiber of her being screamed against it. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. Some things are older than the pack, Kala. Older than wolves. The land remembers. The spirits watch. She thought of the children's laughter. She thought of the warmth of Finn's body as he slept in her arms. She thought of the tired, lonely king who dreamed of building a better world. She poured all of her love, all of her desperate hope for them, into her touch. She pressed her hand against the cold, dark metal. For a moment, nothing happened. The frost continued to spread. Edric watched her, his face a hollow mask of grief, expecting nothing. Then, light erupted from her hand. It was not a fire. It was pure, white, living light, pouring from her palm in a blinding wave. It was the warmth of the sun after a long winter, the heat of a hearth fire, the glow of life itself. It slammed into the curse, and the black frost didn't just melt, it vaporized. It screamed, a thin, unholy sound, as the light consumed it. The light flooded the room, pushing back the shadows, driving out the unnatural cold. It washed over the children, and color returned to their cheeks. Leo coughed, then Lyra, then Finn. Their eyes fluttered open. Kala felt a power she had never known coursing through her. It was ancient and vast, a connection to the very life force of the world. It was her mother's legacy. It was the power of a healer, not just of bodies, but of spirit. An ancestral connection, dormant for years, now roaring to life. She wasn't an Omega. She was something else entirely. Something old and powerful that the pack had forgotten. The dark anchor on the floor cracked, then shattered into dust. The light receded, drawing back into her, leaving the room warm and safe. She slumped to the floor, panting, the effort leaving her drained but vibrantly, terrifyingly alive. The room was silent, save for the sound of the children stirring and calling for their father. Edric didn't go to them. He walked, as if in a trance, to where Kala knelt on the floor. He stared at her, his silver eyes wide with an emotion that transcended awe. It was reverence. It was wonder. It was the look of a man who had just witnessed a miracle. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the healer, the guards, the courtiers who were now crowding the doorway, their faces slack with shock. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched her cheek. His hand was warm. "Kala," he whispered. The name was a prayer. He saw her then, not as an Omega, not as a political pawn, not even as a savior. He saw her as the other half of his soul, the missing piece of his kingdom, the light that answered his darkness. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperate, tender strength. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt the shudder that went through his massive frame. He was a king who never showed weakness, a man made of ice and iron, and he was trembling. "I was so afraid," he murmured against her skin, the confession torn from the deepest part of him. "I thought I had lost them. I thought I had lost everything." She clung to him, her own fear finally giving way to a profound, bone-deep relief. He was alive. The children were alive. They were together. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his silver eyes searching hers. "When I saw you walk into that cold," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I felt my world end, and when I saw you bring back the light, I knew. Knew what? She whispered. That my kingdom doesn't need an alpha queen, he said, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. A real smile, one of pure, radiant joy, finally broke through his harsh features, transforming his face. It needs you. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a king claiming his prize. It was a drowning man finding air. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration made before the eyes of his entire stunned court. It was the sealing of a bond far older and more powerful than any pack law. When he finally broke the kiss, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Calla, he said, the words he'd probably never spoken in his life coming out with a raw, fierce certainty. And it is not going to kill me. It is the only thing that will ever save me. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The self-doubt, the years of being told she was worthless, it all washed away in the face of his love, in the truth of her own power. I love you, Edric, she answered, her voice clear and strong. Behind them, Lord Valerius stood in the doorway, his face the color of ash. He had tried to break the king by attacking his heirs. Instead, he had revealed the king's greatest strength. He had not created a weakness. He had crowned a queen. 6 months later, the northern kingdom was transformed. The snows had receded, giving way to a vibrant spring. But the real warmth came from the heart of the castle. Queen Calla, they called her. The Queen of Light. The Omega who had become their salvation. The story of her exile and the king's desperate search had become legend. The tale of how she had single-handedly broken a dark curse to save the royal heirs was told in every village. Valerius and his co-conspirators were imprisoned, their plot exposed, and their power broken forever. The Blackwood Pack, faced with a newly unified and powerful northern kingdom, had retreated into a wary silence. Calla stood on the same balcony where Edric had stood in cold fury on that terrible night. Now, sunlight streamed over the stone, and the air smelled of damp earth and new blossoms. 2 strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. What is my beautiful queen thinking about? Edric's voice rumbled against her ear. I was just remembering, she said softly, leaning back against his solid warmth. How cold it was. He tightened his embrace, his hand resting protectively over her now swollen belly. You will never be cold again, he promised. I will spend the rest of my life making sure of it. A shout of laughter erupted from the gardens below. Leo, Lyra, and Finn were chasing butterflies, their silver hair flashing in the sun. They were happy and safe, their futures secure. Calla turned in his arms, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. The harsh lines of his face had softened over the past months. The ice in his eyes melted away, leaving only a clear, gentle silver that was reserved for her and their children. He was still a king, still powerful, but he was no longer alone. He was a husband and a father, loved and whole. They called me worthless, she whispered, the memory no longer holding any pain. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss full of love and contentment. They were fools, he murmured against her lips. You were the most valuable thing in this entire kingdom. They were just too blind to see it. She smiled, her heart full to bursting. He had rescued her from exile and despair, and she, the worthless Omega, had rescued him from his cold, lonely throne. They had saved each other. And together, they had built a new world, not of ice and iron, but of warmth and light.